On the record, Jim Morrison's 1971 death was from natural causes. But off the record, there have been numerous legends associated with his passing. Fellow Doors member Ray Manzarek has heard them all.
Well, here are the possibilities in terms of Jim Morrison's death. One, he died of natural causes and self-induced excess. Or Jim was murdered. Who knows what the CIA might have been capable of back then? Or Jim Morrison staged the whole thing.
To this day, questions still linger regarding Jim Morrison's death.
The idea of becoming an adult was abhorrent to him. He just couldn't do it. Becoming an adult meant putting on the yoke of responsibility. And he was the wild child.
Wild child, full of grace.
Morrison's rebellious nature did not endear him to law enforcement. After a confrontation with a policeman during a New Haven concert in December 1967, he was charged with indecent and immoral exhibition. In a similar incident in Miami 2 years later, the singer was arrested for indecent exposure, making headlines around the world.
Police were busting us. Jim was arrested on stage in Miami and New Haven. It turned into absolute insanity and chaos, and all we wanted to do was rock and roll and poetry.
From December 1967 through August 1970, Morrison was arrested 5 times. But the artist who called himself the Lizard King lived life with no regrets. Those who knew him say he felt he only had a limited time in this world. By the time Jim Morrison was 27, the Doors were true rock legends with 8 top 40 hits and a fanatical following. The singer, however, was reportedly growing weary of the rock lifestyle. Jim thought himself a poet first and foremost, and he found playing the role of rock god suffocating.
This is the end.
In early 1971, Morrison moved to Paris with his common-law wife, Pamela Corson.
Jim Morrison said, I'm going to Paris to get away for a little while. I want to get my head together. I want to write some poetry. And I said, that's incredible. Paris is perfect.
I'll never look into your eyes.
But Jim's affair with the pen was short-lived. On July 3rd, Jim Morrison was found slouched in his bathtub, dead of an apparent heart attack. From the beginning, his death was shrouded in mystery.
Our manager goes over there, and then he calls me 3 days later and said, we just buried Jim Morrison this morning. I said, well, how did he look? He said, I don't know. He said, I never saw the body. It was a sealed coffin. And I said, time out. You buried a sealed coffin in Père Lachaise Cemetery, and you never saw Jim Morrison's body? He said, no.
Jim's friends and family back in the States were mystified by the lack of details concerning his death.
The French death certificate merely said his heart stopped. But of course, what caused his heart to stop? No one ever found out. If the death certificate on Jim Morrison had said he died of excess, I would have said yes. I can understand that.
Pamela Corson was the only reported witness to his death. She alone of Jim's friends saw the body before it was buried in Paris's famed Père Lachaise Cemetery.
Pamela died very shortly after that, maybe lived a year or 2 after Jim. I never got to ask her directly what happened. I couldn't do that. I couldn't bring myself to confront his weeping widow lover.
Conspiracy expert Jonathan Venkin suggests that there might have been another explanation for Jim's death.
There was no real official inquest into his death. I mean, even for someone who lived a life like Jim Morrison lived, it's unusual for someone to die of a heart attack at that young age. So, you know, maybe it was a drug overdose, but of course, you then get the conspiracy theories that perhaps it was murder, or perhaps he faked his own death, and this is still alive.
Of all these possibilities, Manzarek doesn't believe that Jim Morrison overdosed.
The police inspected his body. There were no, tracks on his arms, no needle marks. It was not a drug overdose.
What about the murder theory? And if Morrison was murdered, who would have killed a rock star? Some die-hard fans believe that he was the victim of a government conspiracy. Like many rock artists in the early 70s, Morrison had become increasingly radical as the war in Vietnam dragged on. Feeding the rumors of a government conspiracy was the fact that Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin had died less than a year before. Many fans found it strangely coincidental that three hugely influential artists had all died within months of each other.
There is a popular belief that somehow the establishment conspired to either manipulate or squelch the youth movement of the 60s, not just the rock stars, but of course the Martin Luther Kings and the Malcolm X's. It's not that great of a leap of faith to think that there was some sort of program to actually kill these people. I don't think that's terribly unreasonable.
If there was a conspiracy, and if they did plan on doing it, the reason they did it is because they represented the three archetypes of American youth. The young black man, the young black prince, dressed like a gypsy, singing songs of love and psychedelic madness and beauty. Janis Joplin, the woman, the female principal, singing her heart out, singing the blues. And Jim Morrison, the heir apparent to the throne. He was the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant prince.
But Manzarek isn't completely sold on the government conspiracy theory.
He was not murdered. I don't think the CIA did him in. I don't think the government is smart enough to have stopped Jim, Janis, and Jimmy. And yet it's possible.
You walked on down the hallway, baby.
Others believe that Jim Morrison isn't dead at all. As with Elvis Presley, legions of fans insist that Morrison faked his own death to escape the limelight.
I get people talking to me all the time about Jim Morrison. Jim is everywhere. Jim's in Africa. I got a letter from somebody saying we're going to take a boat and we're going to go to Africa and we're going to find Jim. Because at the end of Wild Child, Jim says, "Remember when we were in Africa?"
You remember when we were in Africa?
On the other hand, Ray Manzarek believes if anybody could successfully stage his own death, it would be Jim Morrison.
See, I like to think that if Jim, in fact, staged his own death, he went away and went on a journey to the East. Jim Morrison may very well have become a Buddha. That's what I'm hoping, more than anything. There's a coffin in Père Lachaise Cemetery that may or may not contain the remains of James Douglas Morrison.
The days are bright and filled with pain. Enclose me in your gentle rain. The time you ran was too insane. We'll meet again. We'll meet again. Oh, tell me where your freedom lies. The streets are fields that never die. Deliver me from reasons why you'd rather cry. I'd rather fly. I'd rather fly.